Can you all hear me? Yeah? Good. I'm reading from a script. Don't worry, it's not the yellow pages. It's actually got lots of useful information, but it actually helps me sort of order and frame the context of my lecture. My presentation today focuses on the subject of shamanism and if the subject has any value to the subject of ufology, in particular the close encounter experience. Is it possible that the UFO experience is a modern Western demonstration of shamanism, or indeed could the witness be fulfilling the role of shaman, or shaman, you can pronounce both. Similarities to shamanism is briefly mentioned in the UFO literature, but has rarely been explored to any depth. In Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, the late Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack wrote, "There are peoples around the world who customarily communicate with non-human intelligences and spirits through a variety of means. These communications and the myths they generate are an integral part of the cosmologies of many non-Western cultures, constituting for each a kind of ontological skeleton upon which hangs the balance of culture, customs, and lifestyle. Throughout history, many societies have acknowledged consciousness as something more potent than we have in the West, as a sieve of receiver and transmitter of communication with forces not always visible other than ourselves. The contemporary Western tenet that we are not alone in the universe, conversant only with ourselves, is, in fact, a minority perspective. It is an anomaly." Mack highlights the point that we in the Western world have made ourselves different to everyone else. From the time of the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Technology, it appears that the West has developed a superior philosophy or way of life, something we like to think of as progress, intellectually, technologically, even culturally. Perhaps this offers us an explanation as to why normal, rational individuals are making claims that they have had vision-like experiences, alleged contact with another apparent superior intelligence from advanced technological craft we regard as extraterrestrial. Through the witnesses' narrative, the ETs they encounter reveal a nature that is very much human. For example, asking witnesses for water, offering witnesses biscuits, and even having a fascination with our bodies and sexual intercourse. Mack informs us that alien abductions and the effects on abductees possess their own uniqueness. He describes the work of folklorist Peter Rochevich, who, through comparing the experiences of abductees with other aerial and abduction phenomena, alludes to the possibility that there's an intelligence behind the UFO experience and extraordinary encounters of all types, one that adapts its form and appearance to fit the environment of the times. In his conclusion, John Mack states, "It needs to be stressed that we do not know if any of the above phenomena exist literally on a purely material plane of reality, despite the apparent physical manifestations. It could all be educational, a kind of mythic drama intended by a transcendent intelligence to move our being to a higher level." Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Dr. Jacques Vallée, the grandfathers of modern ufology, both comment on strange behavior of UFOs in their book, The Edge of Reality. If UFOs are indeed somebody else's nuts and bolts hardware, then we must still explain how such tangible hardware can change shape before our eyes, vanish, seemingly melt away in front of us, or apparently materialize mysteriously before us, without apparent detection by persons nearby or in neighbouring towns. We must wonder too where UFOs are hiding when not manifesting themselves to human eyes. Jacques Vallée, in Passport to Magonia, makes an intriguing revelation that the UFO occupants, like the elves of old, are not extraterrestrials, they are denizens of another reality. John Keel of the Mothman Prophecies fame offered his conclusion in 1967 that the evidence for extraterrestrial origin is purely circumstantial. He hinted in print that perhaps a more complex situation was involved. My talk is split into two parts. The first part is a general discussion on shamanism and how this is understood today. The second part explores the close encounter experience. A dictionary definition of shamanism is a religion of certain peoples of northern Asia based upon the belief that the world is pervaded by good and evil spirits who can be influenced or controlled by the shaman. The definition also states that it relates to any similar religion involving forms of spiritualism. Anthropologist Joy Henry explains that the word shaman refers specifically to the Tungus tribe in Siberia, from where the word originates. The noun describes a specialist who has a soul which can leave their body and travel to a heaven or an underworld. There they communicate with the spirits and they return with clear memories of their experience. He has a unique bond with the other world. More importantly, he controls spirits and is an expert in ecstasy. There are different paths to becoming a shaman. One path entails an individual responding to an abrupt and obscure call, like the Sangoma in Swaziland. The invitation is perceived by the individual to be a sign, such as visions, hearing an inner voice or seeing signs. Failure to respond to this call is often met with punishment in the form of misfortune, illness, and even death. Acceptance often means that the calling spirit soon appears in some outward, visible shape and communicates in a more explicit way. In weaker individuals, the calls will take the form of dreams. The second path relates to an individual inheriting the position in either the male or female line and is sometimes mandatory. The individual is aware that they had a history of experiences from a young age. This person is selected because it's believed they possess certain psychic qualities. The third path is the yearning of an individual to follow a spiritual path. Initiation sees the transformation of an individual into a shaman, and this is often a long period of discomfort and incredible pain, which has the potential to last months, even years. Individuals tend to get the calling when they are young. In some Amazonian cultures, a shaman's power diminishes with age. Here we see a couple of clay vessels from the north coast of Peru. Both are known as stirrup spout vessels that were made by the Moche people around the 9th and 10th centuries AD. They depict the transformation of the shaman into an animal. One is an owl, the other is a seabird. I wanted to show you the piece on the left, as owls are culturally powerful symbols, and they appear to feature in a small number of UFO-related experiences. These vessels convey a belief that shamans have the ability to transform themselves, a means by which they enter the spirit world. At about this time period, ruling nobles were also considered sacred, and that they had access to the divine. Interestingly enough, wild cats, crabs, lobsters, reptiles, and snakes are also depicted on anthropomorphic transformations because these creatures were viewed as liminal creatures in that they could travel between worlds, very similar to cats and dogs of other cultures. Again, powerful symbols that also feature in the narratives of 17th century witch trials in this country and also modern UFO experiences. For example, the black dog viewed by Whitley Strieber on board the craft he allegedly was on. There is a strong religious association between these animals and beliefs in regeneration and the importance of rebirth within the cycle of life. Life and death are obvious forces that deeply affect our lives. Shamans act as mediators between the human world and the invisible world of the spirit. They themselves are liminal practitioners, that is, they possess the ability to cross boundaries. That's the important point to make here. They also have the gift to bring about change through their activities, change for the individual and change for the social group they belong to. Engagement with spirits can be done by anyone and is usually done at key points in a person's life. Initiates become transformed themselves, leaving behind their old selves and being reborn or changed into a new one. Shamans have purpose and meaning, and that they have to, 1, engage with spirits. They enter a trance to journey to the spirit world with the aim of communicating with spirits. They develop relationships with spirits, which includes knowing them by name and sometimes conducting sexual activity with them, even controlling them. Also, communication takes the form of channeling the power of the other world to benefit the community. Such benefit often means finding a cure to heal a person or even to curse, locating the causes of misfortune, the ability to divine, for example, to find lost things, and finally the ability to bring order in the form of messages, particularly during times of crisis. This can also bring about positive change. The way of life includes fasting, living a life in isolation, sometimes displaying strange or unexplained behavior, and reflection meditation. Larry Ellis, in his article Trickster, Shaman of the Liminal, tells us from his knowledge of native North American culture that a shaman is a valued and essential member of the tribe, but to some degree will always remain the outsider, powerful, unpredictable, and incomprehensible. He draws his power from the realm of the liminal, wielding it in a manner that parodies the significance of what he accomplishes. Writing for the Journal of African Studies in 1997, Ian Lewis described shamanism as a traditional spirit-inspired diagnostician, a healer, a ritual expert who is a specialist in religious ecstasy. He goes on to explain that the use of the term shaman outside its original Siberian context is by no means unproblematic. Consequently, the extent to which shamanism represents a universal religious phenomenon or set of phenomena is a matter for debate. That debate does continue to this day. Shamanism is not a universal religion, but it is a practice that exists in almost every culture, but there are differences and variations. This is important to bear in mind when looking at close encounter experiences. We must not make the mistake of expecting to find like-for-like experiences, but important parallels. In 19th century Africa, the Nganga was one such individual, today referred to by museum ethnographers like myself as a ritual specialist. It's very hard to find a specific word that rightly fits the working of a shaman. In South Africa, these people are called Sangoma. The Inuit of Baffin Islands have someone they called Angakut. In Peru and Ecuador rainforest, we have the Uashin. Interestingly enough, in Japan, the female shaman is called Fujo and is divided into two kinds of specialists. Those who are blind are normally associated with communication with the dead, and those who have sight normally interact with divine spirits called kami. Cultural names aside, their roles are strikingly similar, and I will continue using the term shaman as everyone here understands that reference. I would prefer to use the term mediator, but this reminds me of hostage abduction, negotiations, and relationship counseling. Our understanding of the shaman is really only a recent development. Historically, the shaman in the 16th and 17th centuries was treated in much the same way as those accused of witchcraft and devil worship, and they often met a similar fate. During the 18th century, in the Age of Enlightenment, despite the interest in the occult by certain movements, shamans were viewed with suspicion as superstitious jugglers, conjurers, tricksters who did nothing but deceive the ill with magical tricks for their own gain. Observers still had difficulties understanding them. It actually wasn't until the late 19th and 20th centuries that anthropologists had actually understood the purpose and role in society through participant observation. In 1946, S.F. Nadel made numerous observations amongst the Nuba peoples of the Sudan and used the term shaman to translate the vernacular Naimo term kujo, which he reports is applied to describe spirit-inspired priests who divine the future and diagnose and treat illness at seances while they are in a state of trance. The spirits concerned are anthropomorphic. They are human-like in appearance. They come to the shaman from outside, and when he is in a trance, gain hold of his body. In trance, the spirit mounts the shaman as a rider does a horse and enters his head. Nadel was able to contend that the Sudanese cult was equivalent to classical shamanism in Central Asia and Northwest America. It rests on the belief that spirits may possess human beings and onto the practice of establishing communication with the supernatural through human beings so possessed. The person possessed, the shaman, is more than merely a temporary and passive medium through which others place themselves en rapport with the spirit world. Through his ability to induce possession, he is also a master of these supernatural powers. Finally, Dr. Audrey Coulson lived with the Akawau people in British Guyana, and she told us that the spirits who inhabit a shaman's body also assist with social-making decisions. These decisions would frequently reflect public opinion, concerns, and anxieties. Another valid point to be noted for later. In many cultures, the spirit world is adjacent to the human one, and spirits are believed to regularly interact with people, sometimes with consent, and many other times without their consent. This is much the same as the European tradition of fairy folklore. Shamans exist in an animistic world where spirits are everywhere, but are sometimes considered the souls of the deceased and real entities. For example, the Australian Aborigines believe in the tiny Mimi spirit, which hides from people, but from time to time comes out of rocks to forage for food. Sometimes spirits relate to deceased family members who protect settlements. For example, the beliefs of those living in former Kafiristan, a region within old Afghanistan at a time prior to forced conversion to Islam by the ruling Mehta. These ancestral spirits were sacred to every village and would be suspended by posts outside the village entrance to warn off intruders. Speaking of Islam, I was informed by a colleague that in the Middle East, a UFO would not necessarily be perceived as an alien flying saucer, but as a jinn or evil spirit. In Nigeria, the ancestral spirits are revered and offered libations and sacrifices in return for protection and guidance. In the Amazon rainforest, as one can imagine, the spirits take the form of birds, amphibians, and lizards, but they also take human form and again relate to ancestors of those long deceased. Despite appearances, almost every culture acknowledges a real relationship with the spirit world, as this ensures new birth and regeneration after death. The modern Western world is the exception. Instead, we have aliens and spacecraft. Perhaps this is our version of the spirit world, but we fail to recognize it. Cultural perception of anomalies plays a big part in how we interpret experiences, and I recommend reading texts by researchers such as John Spencer, who discusses perception in such depth. The Unsuri-Shwa are a forest people living in eastern Ecuador and Peru, and they believe that life and death is dependent upon negotiating the invisible forces that surround us. The spirit world empowers them. It gives them status, meaning, and purpose. In fact, they frequently go in search of souls because without them they believe they would die. Their worldview is a fascinating one, in that they see the normal waking state as a lie. To them, it's not reality. In fact, they believe that by entering the spirit world, they see and experience the real world. Events that are initiated there have a great impact on the waking world. However, they also believe that to get there, one has to enter a trance state. And this is done in the Amazon by taking hallucinogens. I must stress here that not every culture uses hallucinogenic drugs. Many cultures enter a trance state by fasting, drumming, dancing, singing. A Western comparison would be akin to a young person going to a nightclub, a rave, dancing the night away, listening to drum and bass. It's the vibration that takes them into an altered state of consciousness. And very often young people do come away with a sense of great elation. As a master of spirits, the shaman with experience should be able to do this at will. In other words, they can willingly enter the spirit world when they want to, but there will be other occasions when they are forced to enter the spirit world through no choice of their own. Very similar to people who report what they classed as abductees, very close encounters. They're forced to have this experience. This is a shaman's rattle from Northwest Coast America, carved by Joe David. Some anthropologists have experienced the trance state for themselves and reported these observations. One example comes from Everett Thurn, who was living with the Mukushi in British Guyana. whilst understanding the techniques involved, such as drumming and voice impersonations, he was actually aware of being in a trance state and ascending to a place he didn't recognize. Afterwards, when walking out into a storm, he felt aware that the environment felt very different. It felt alive. An American anthropologist, Dr. Michael Harner, conducted much field work with the Unsuri Shwa. The previous slide showed a member of the community. And through his seminal work, the Ivaro, he tells us that the Shwa believe that they have three types of souls. The Arutam Wakani, which is an acquired soul, and they believe that a man can possess only two souls at any one time. The second is the Muisak, or the avenging soul. And the third is the Nekas Wakani, the true or ordinary soul. Acquiring a soul can be obtained by any man or woman. In a patrilineal society like the Shwa, it is the men who feel the need to go on vision quests. It's relevant to note here that entities in some of the more profound close encounter experiences talk to the witnesses about the importance of souls and also the subject of death, in some cases seeing apparitions of the deceased they knew. The Arutam Wakani is the most important soul. In their language, Arutam relates to a particular kind of vision or apparition, and Wakani means soul. Arutam Wakani, according to anthropologist Michael Harner, translates as the ancient spectre soul. This soul is believed to produce a vision. When it does appear, it does so only briefly to the witness. The soul exists externally once it is created. Whilst the accumulation of soul energy is important, souls will often leave the bodies of individuals in search of those who need them most. Therefore, whilst the soul is eternal, it never stays long in any one person. It will either wander or be stolen. This is a group of Unsuri Shwa posing with a shrunken head that's nicely planted on a stick. They're just posing for the camera. It's not part of any normal ritual. It's just for a tourist shot. Within Shwa cosmology, it is the Arutam soul that permits the Shwa to seek security from death. They believe that any who possesses such a spirit cannot be killed by any natural form of physical violence, poison, or by sorcery. A person possessing two souls cannot be killed at all. If someone is killed in combat, it is believed that they have lost their soul. There are numerous occasions when a soul is to be sought and acquired. One such event is when a boy as young as 6 accompanies his father and makes a pilgrimage to a local waterfall. It is believed that souls meet at such places and they wander about as breezes. They bathe in the cold water of the waterfall and chant. In the night time they fast, drink tobacco water, and await the appearance of the soul. The wait can last several days. After this time, they go back home and try again another time. On repeated occasions, a pilgrim will drink natema or mekwa, both potent hallucinogens that produce a state of excitation, delirium, hallucinations, and narcosis. The young person is cared for by the adults around him until midnight, when he awakens to find the Arutam soul. If lucky, and there's no guarantee of success, the soul will appear in one of a number of forms that are relevant to the Shwa. The young person will either encounter a pair of giant jaguars fighting, 2 anacondas fighting, a single disembodied human head, or a ball of fire drifting through the forest toward the seeker. Once encountered, the young boy must touch the soul to demonstrate his bravery. Once inside, he returns to the camp and then home telling nobody about his experience. In his sleep, the soul will converse to him, usually an old man who offers him wisdom and guidance, and it will then enter his body. The young man then feels a sudden power surge and a new feel of confidence. In a way, these experiences relate to an individual's ability in reaching maturity, to demonstrate their skills and their knowledge. It makes them feel normal, and they become part of the community. It's all about feeling normal. There are many other ways in which a Shwa man will obtain a soul, but I think I find it interesting to read about Michael Harner's own shamanic experience. By the way, Hana has published a number of books, including The Way of the Shaman, as a means of developing shamanism in Western society, so that folk here can partake and gain the benefits of shamanic trance journeys. This is a fascinating discourse, but perhaps you fail to recognize that shamans already walk among us, that they have no guides and do not fit into the norm of the mechanics that run our society. In fact, they themselves probably don't know that they are shamans. Hana writes that whilst living with the Canibo people in Peru between 1957 and 61, he had two experiences that opened his eyes to shamanism. He found that whilst people were friendly, they were reluctant to talk to him about the supernatural. After a while, they did open up to him, and they said that if we really wanted to know about the subject, then he really needs to take ayahuasca, which he did. This is known as the soul vine or the little death. Shamans do not take too much of this stuff because it does actually affect your mind and can send you mad. The next day he had to fast, and later at sunset he was allowed to take this sacred drink. He lay down on a bamboo platform in a communal house, and with the exception of animals in the distance, he was surrounded by silence. His visions began with strange bright lights appearing, and he could hear once distant sounds that seemed so close to him. He then felt numb, and all about him was dark. He describes the scene around him as a celestial cavern because of the bright violet hues. And then he could see dim figures engaged in shadowy movements. In the center of the room, stood a gigantic person with a crocodilian head and surrounded with torrential waters coming out of its massive jaws. The water level rose and the scene changed into a place of blue, sky above, sea below. This is an interpretation of what a vision would look like if you'd taken ayahuasca. He soon began to see strange boats wafting back and forth, floating through the air, coming towards him, getting closer and closer until he could discern something he described as being like a Viking longboat. Accompanying this was the most beautiful singing, high-pitched and ethereal singing emanating from voices on board the galley. He could see several hundred humanoid-like people with bird-headed faces similar to the deity paintings of ancient Egyptians. He was convinced that he was dying and that these people had come to take his soul away. And as his soul was leaving his body, he could feel numbness inside him. He couldn't move at all. According to Hana, it felt like his body was turning to concrete. And as the numbness affected his chest, he could not move or speak. It's a bit like sleep paralysis. He was unable to ask anybody around him for help or for the antidote. He was told by the people on the boat that because he was dying, it was safe for him to receive visions and information. These were the secrets reserved for the dying and the dead. The givers of this information were giant reptilian creatures that he could vaguely see in the gloomy dark depths at the back of his mind. They then projected a visual scene in front of him. First, they showed him the planet Earth as it was aeons ago, before there was any life on it. He could see the ocean, barren land, and a bright blue sky. Then he saw black specks dropping from the sky in their hundreds, winged black creatures that flopped to Earth utterly exhausted from their trip. And they explained to him in a kind of thought language that they were fleeing from something out in space. They had come to Earth to escape their enemy. It's something out of a H.P. Lovecraft story. The creatures then showed me, he says, how they created life on the planet in order to hide themselves amongst the other life forms there. He learned that the dragon-like creatures were thus inside all forms of life, including humans. They were the true masters of humanity and the entire planet. We humans were but the receptacles and servants of these creatures. He felt that these dragon-like creatures felt increasingly alien and possibly evil, and that they were about to take his soul and his life. Hana, he describes, managed to cry out for help, and they gave him the antidote, so he eventually came out of this vision. Symbolically, the images and patterns Even the messages of his experience sound very much like some of the close encounter experiences reported by abductees and contactees. Granted, many abductees tell us that their experiences with aliens take place aboard a spacecraft, but how do we know that this isn't a symbol their minds haven't absorbed culturally, or that the experience could take on a more relevant meaning for them? Surely the experience is meant to incorporate symbols that relate directly to a person's background and their society. For example, if an abductee encounters giant talking snakes in a forest, their experience may not have as much meaning for them. They may not even call themselves abductees. They may not consider their encounter to convey any message at all. Hannah has never expressed any interest or knowledge of ufology. In fact, I was very privileged to have a chat with him recently. He called me at home. And one of the questions I did ask him was, well, wasn't your experience shaped by your knowledge? You're an academic. Wasn't it shaped on your knowledge of ancient Egypt and maybe Scandinavia? And he said, no. And I'll tell you something else. My experience was real. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And I was like, hang on, you're an anthropologist. You were a curator at the Smithsonian Museum, and you're telling me that this experience was not just a drug-induced vision. It was actually a real experience. And he said, yes. And he's just an anthropologist. It doesn't mean he's an expert in everything. It's just his opinion. But I value his honesty, and that these visions are actually life-changing. They have meaning for people. And this is the point I'd like to come to a little bit later on. Now, he also says that in retrospect, one could say that these dark little creatures were almost like DNA, even though in 1961 I knew nothing about DNA. It's only a recent development. Now, Hannah has had this experience with the aid of hallucinogens, but there are a number of similar accounts with shamans who recall their encounters, especially when it's clear that good and even evil spirits seem to fight over humankind, but the shamans have these encounters via non-drug-induced trance states. So these experiences are happening around the world. It's true that many cultures will not see alien craft, but instead will interpret an anomaly as something perfectly acceptable within the framework of their cultural beliefs. For example, according to F.W. Thompson in West African Secret Societies, published in 1929, the witches of northern Ghana are often seen flying in the sky late at night in the form of balls of fire, or the spirits of the dead are visible as a slight glow seen through the night. If the cultural framework is the system by which we perceive or interpret the phenomena, then perhaps the various UFO shapes being reported, for example, flying saucers, flying triangles, the cigar shape, etc., are actually symbols that relate specifically to our own culture. In this way, the experience and the symbols relating to it might have meaning for the experiencer. Perhaps then we can understand the UFO as a shamanic event, possibly a vision, or possibly as an agent of change. The Western world, of course, does have its fair share of people who claim to have a special ability to connect with the invisible world. They vary widely, and they include spiritualist mediums, contactees, abductees, followers of the Ethereal Society, and a multitude of New Age beliefs that are promoted throughout the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. I do heartily recommend Emma Wilby's book, 2005 work, Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits, Shamanistic Visionary Traditions in Early Modern British Witchcraft and Magic. Despite science and technology, Western culture is historically rich in cultural tradition and folklore. And I think sometimes we forget this. So now on to close encounter experiences. The term close encounter is an idea originating with Jacques Vallée and J.N. Hynek for classifying a specific experience. I understand the term to mean an aerial anomaly that is visible, and the people witnessing them, it's in close proximity to the observer. There might be some form of communication, interaction, even the appearance of occupants. The experience sometimes involves observer isolation. In other words, we just have a single witness, whereas no one else sees it. And they come across intelligent-like behaviour displayed by the anomaly or its occupants. The experience is so far removed from the observer's reality that it is sometimes difficult to comprehend. And how do you convey to someone who hasn't experienced it that deep experience? And I've experienced it myself. In his book, UFOs Operation Trojan Horse, John Keel asked, how do you investigate something that doesn't exist? The answer, he claimed, is that you investigate and study the people who have experienced these things. You don't investigate them by checking their reliability. You study the medical and psychological effects of their experiences. This cannot be done by teenagers with telescopes and housewives with tape recorders. Now, he wrote this many years ago. Please excuse him. It must be done by trained professionals. Investigations into UFO sightings traditionally place a particular focus on the anomalous object, on the UFO itself. Investigations are sometimes led by the personal beliefs of the investigator. Only a small part of the inquiry is given to the people we call witnesses. I want to mention here Elsie Oakenson, a famous UFO witness whose experience led her to change direction in her life and actively take up spiritual healing. Oakenson herself felt that many witnesses were regularly being squeezed into other people's theories. UFO investigations have at times involved the need to include specialists, such as astronomers, biologists, physicists, meteorologists, psychologists, etc. But the interpretation of such information has often been produced by unqualified amateurs. And finally, whilst there are forums for discussion, raw case data is rarely seen by the public for the purpose of closer scrutiny. In 1972, the late astronomer Dr. J.L. Hynek, consultant to US Air Force's Project Sign, Grudge and Blue Book, and the father of modern ufology, wrote, "Though it can't be explained yet, the UFO experience has every semblance of being a real event to the UFO reporter and his companions. That is our starting point. The UFO reporter is our data gathering instrument. Data and data gathering are important elements in understanding the subject, so long as the right questions are being asked. In the last 60 years, and this is my own opinion, the focus has either been on the UFO, the object itself, or in the hypnosis narratives gleaned from the abduction experiences. I do feel that the person who reports their experience has often been squeezed into someone else's theory, and that little appropriate attention has been given to the witness. An investigation into a close encounter should take into account not just the observed anomaly, but also the witness, their environment, even their lives. And this perspective might reveal something interesting." In Liverpool, 1994, my hometown, Mike, and that's his false name, a local government officer in his late 20s, survived a serious car crash. He was lucky to have been able to walk out of the wreckage. His knee was seriously injured. He was also traumatized by the event, and in the days that followed, he lost his confidence and refused to get back into a car and drive. Many of us have experienced that. The emotional and physical symptoms he was displaying were diagnosed by his GP as shock, depression, and anxiety, and he was prescribed a low dose of fluoxetine hydrochloride, Prozac, great stuff, I've taken it myself, but wasn't given any counselling. It even affected his daily working life in the City Council's benefits office. He was transferred temporarily to another department doing light work until he felt he was able to return to normal work. However, no matter how much he tried, he didn't want to continue working there. Mike wanted to move on. He'd been successful in his job since he left school. He'd been promoted a couple of times, but he wasn't happy with the circumstances at work. At home, he was still living with his parents. It was a clear opportunity to develop his life and to spend his savings. Prior to the car crash, Mike had had major surgery, but the crash had caused him sufficient pain. His doctor recommended physiotherapy to help him, and he did this by taking up Tai Chi. Mike was not a happy individual, but the Tai Chi did allow him to work on his confidence again. As part of his daily routine, he also walked the dog in the evening. The circular route was along Moston Avenue and Ramsey Road, which is in Allerton. And just after midnight of the 4th of August, he took his excited dog out and started walking down the lamplit road. The route would take him through familiar territory, and wherever there was a clear night, he took comfort in looking at the night sky. On this particular night, something drew his attention to the roof of a neighbouring house. Above the roof hovered a large, bright red ball of light. Again, we're talking about symbols and signs here. He had never seen anything like this before, and he stopped and stared at it. He observed that the ball made no noise, but was pulsating from right to left, organic-like. He watched it for at least a minute, but he was suddenly distracted by his dog happily snuffling around someone else's front garden. The dog hadn't noticed the red ball of light at all. Mike looked down briefly and called his dog to get out of the garden. When he looked up again, the red light had vanished from sight. Not a very spectacular UFO sighting, is it? No fog, no strange occupants, just a ball of light. But a light that appeared very close to the witness. Mike continued walking the dog, but this time, and typically so, he's looking for the object, but it doesn't reappear. He went home completely puzzled by what he had seen, to the extent that he needed to know what it was. This is where I came in, as he contacted me. I had been his friend for 10 years. I looked into the event as a ufologist and tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps there was some mundane explanation for the mysterious red ball, but I couldn't find one. There was a geological fault line 600 meters to the west, but could fault line activity be responsible for his sighting? I have no idea. How about hallucinations caused by temporal lobe activity? This wasn't an avenue of inquiry I was qualified to follow, nor did it seem logical. Equally puzzled, I continued interviewing him about his experience, even asked him questions. And I don't know if you remember Albert Budden. Do you remember Albert Budden produced a book about electric UFOs, electric pollution? Do you remember it all? If you don't, it's recommended reading. But he developed a questionnaire to see if people were suffering through electronic pollution. It was inducing visions, and I used his electrohypersensitivity questionnaire. I then spoke to my friend about his life. The conclusion I came to didn't come to me immediately, but several months later. Mike had experienced other phenomena, events he believed were paranormal. For example, he was lying in bed at night when he could feel the paws of a cat sink into the mattress as it approached him, but he had no cat. At other times when lying in bed, he could feel a dark presence in his room. This would sometimes be accompanied by a pressure on his body, even a failure to move at all. He had even seen a white face appear close to his own and hiss threateningly at him. And this is like old hag syndrome, sleep paralysis. His struggle with this force was eventually broken by a bout of swearing. Old hag syndrome, sleep paralysis, is an obvious correct analysis for these experiences. However, Mike also told me that apparently as a baby in his mother's womb, the umbilical cord had wrapped itself tightly around his neck, almost killing him. As a young boy, his uncle had sexually abused him. He had grown into a sensible, mature, intelligent young man with a talent for art. Very intelligent, but chose not to go to university, but instead found himself in a steady, well-paid job with local authority. Are any of these details important? Does personality and life experience enable a person to be prone to anomalous activity? Well, you may have read in other UFO books that people are either in the right place at the right time, or some people tend to be creative and they are drawn to a particular place because of these creative abilities, whether they paint or they draw or they read poetry or they play music. But I think it's an important part of the puzzle, and I think it's worth exploring. From the time of his sighting, he felt excitement again, an excitement for life. He finished his course of antidepressants, and he didn't want to repeat his prescription. His Tai Chi enabled him to strengthen his body, and he got his confidence back. He got back into the car, and he was driving again, but this only really kicked in after he had his UFO sighting. And we're talking here about a couple of weeks, not months. He then decided that he needed a change in employment and decided to become a travel rep. The money wasn't as much as he was earning then, but it meant a change of environment. He regained his confidence, applied for a position with 5 different tour companies, all of which wanted to employ him. He was clearly on this path to recovery. To be honest, the strange ball of light was not of interest to me, but the more profound effect his observation had on him at a time when his life needed change. It doesn't really matter if the ball of light was caused naturally or if it was an apparition or a vision. I believe that Mike's mysterious red light was something induced somehow by his own mind to stimulate a process of healing. I see this as a shamanic act, and that Mike was mediating with another form of reality, so to speak. The encounter gave him meaning, and it actually empowered him. When dealing with UFO sightings, there will be occasions when we must ask ourselves, does the appearance of an anomaly have a purpose? Does it have a function? Is it for anyone's benefit? To accept this, then one must accept that in these exotic cases, there is an intelligence behind them. The first thing to mention is that somehow the observer is attracted to the anomaly, to red light. Somehow they just look up for no apparent reason. The anomaly then holds the observer's attention for a while, as if to inform them that this specific moment has just become a part of their reality. 10 minutes. Brill. I'm going to talk about a case that's been written about in several magazines, but I was actually one of the original investigators. In 1995, I was a member of the Northern Anomalies Research Organisation, which was run by Peter Huff. And I was asked by lead investigator Alicia Lee to participate in what was to become known as the Robert Shaw case. This was based in Urmston, just outside Manchester. The case had come to the group's attention 9 months after the event had allegedly happened. The witness's real name is Harvey. It doesn't matter that I mention his name now. And at the time, he was a postman. On Christmas night in 1994, just after 9:30 p.m, Harvey was watching television. He was waiting for a taxi to take him to his sister's house for the festive celebrations. Outside, through the window, in an area close to his first floor flat, he observed a formation of 5 large lights in a vertical column slowly descending to the ground below treetop level. Harvey felt transfixed and drawn to them. He found the lights to be incredibly beautiful. They were his words. Harvey immediately got up, put on his coat, ventured outside to get a better look. He bumped into a couple of friends, but he left them to find the source of the lights. He walked into a wooded area, but felt what he described as a primeval fear, and that something was wrong, and that he shouldn't have been there at all. He actually gave in to that emotion and turned back. Harvey didn't remember what happens next. In fact, he woke up the next morning in bed with his clothes still on. He didn't remember a thing about the evening. He doesn't remember a taxi turning up to pick him up, doesn't remember what his sister Claire had told him. She had called him on Christmas evening to find out why he hadn't turned up. He answered the phone, but wasn't being his normal self in any way. It seemed strikingly odd that Harvey had picked up the phone while he was still undergoing his experience. He doesn't remember picking up the phone and speaking to her. The next morning, he took a neighbour to the wooded area. She was an air hostess, where they found a muddy area, and in the centre of the reeds had unusually been pushed flat to the ground. They didn't look right as they were covered with a thin black substance. He describes it as having a different texture, which was bone dry, which is peculiar as it had been raining Christmas Day and night. The on-site investigation was flawed from the start. We wanted to analyse the soil, analyse the trees as the bark at a certain height had burn marks on them. But this was being done 9 months after the initial event and too late to get any serious data that could perhaps throw any light on the anomalous object he had seen, or to try and explain what had caused the damage on the trees. Maybe they're not even linked at all. It was a pointless exercise conducted by, in great part, the enthusiasm of amateurs for wanting to get to the bottom of the experience and our complete naivety in failing to understand how time plays a crucial part in an investigation. Alicia and I interviewed Harvey in September, and he told us that even several months after the event, he still felt angry, irritated, and miserable. Harvey was a fairly good illustrator. He enjoyed painting as a hobby, and he felt compelled to draw something that reflected his experience. His first drawing, Harvey told me, consisted of aliens we would describe as greys. He was aware of the image prior to his experience, but this picture didn't do it for him, and he tore it up. However, the second picture he drew made more sense to him. It shows a central column covered in branches and leaves, and at the base are little alien fellows, which he described were very insignificant to his experience. They were not important to his experience, but the column was. With hindsight, we can look at the picture and see the column for what it is, a symbol of strength and beginnings, branches and leaves that suggest life. Unfortunately, in October that year, Harvey was hypnotically regressed by an author and a hypnotherapist. I have a copy of the transcript. This was an unfortunate step to take. For me, Harvey's experience sounds more like an altered state of consciousness, possibly relating to a hypnagogic experience. So I ask, what is the point of putting someone in an altered state of consciousness, i.e. hypnosis, to remember something that happened in an altered state of consciousness? It just doesn't make sense. And this logic can also be applied to anomalistic experiences that take place when someone is in bed. Logically speaking, if people go to bed to sleep, then surely their experience is likely to reflect visions created via a sleep state. And I'm not saying that the experience is not real. I'm just saying to get to that altered state of consciousness, you actually do it via the sleep state. Unfortunately, the further years of UFO sightings in the 80s and 90s was special because they were leading up to the millennium and the fears and anxieties associated with it. Even Harvey had told me that the hypnosis meant nothing to him. In the transcript, Harvey reports seeing bright lights and angelic beings, which he is pushed to describe. In fact, the only useful piece of information gleaned from the hypnosis was his response to the question, "What do you mean things have been bad?" His answer is, "Well, it's kind of the usual stuff. You know, girlfriends. I feel slightly trapped. I guess in the flat or being tied to the flat." There was also his job, which he wanted to leave. So there's obviously a yearning inside him for change, maybe on a subconscious level. His personal anxieties were a cause for concern, and Harvey required change. The questioners also pushed Harvey into telling them information he had been told by the intelligence behind the UFO. Information he shouldn't. Basically, he said the intelligence of his experience had said to him, "Do not say anything to anybody else. This is just for you." In a way that Michael Harner was saying that because I was dying, I was allowed to have this information, but I can't tell anybody else. We seem to have, if anything, the information being obtained was to help the witness, not the people asking the questions, so it was personal. We seem to have a problem with the idea that visions are dreamlike, and that as conscious individuals, we would know the difference between reality and when we're awake and the reality of the dream state. The fact remains that people cannot tell the difference sometimes. much in the same way as ghost stories are told when a witness is telling you that the person they've just spoken to suddenly dematerializes. It's exactly the same with UFO cases. They might look physically real, but the whole event is probably taking place between our world and another, as Jenny Rendell's coined the phrase, the Oz factor. If we are to solve one part of the UFO mystery, then we need to start asking relevant questions about the witness. In the early 1980s, BUFORA investigator Ken Phillips and meteorologist environmental psychologist Dr. Alex Kuehl spent a great deal of time focusing on the witness and their life history, hence the word anamnesis, or life memory. This project had produced some interesting results. It would be worthwhile starting a witness study of this sort again so that we can obtain data that would be useful in allowing us to understand what's going on. If I can just point out some data here. If we look into this category, we've got 3 columns: UFO witnesses, those who have psychic experiences in a control group. And one of the categories is change in life after observation. UFOs, it's 10 out of 15 participants have had serious change, whereas with the psychic group, out of 15 members, there's only 4, and in the control group, there isn't anybody. As an investigator, when listening to witnesses describe to me their experiences, the most frustrating part of it is not being able to answer the following questions. Why me? What have I to, why have, I can't even write my own thing properly. Why do I have to go through this? And what does this all mean? Perhaps with a more appropriate study of the witness, I will be able to give more appropriate answers. Perhaps I will be to offer assurance by telling them about the role and purpose of the shaman. Perhaps then they will start feeling normal about the experiences they have and have something of value to offer themselves and our society. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Again, like I said, with most speakers, anybody wants to ask Tony any questions, feel free to do so. You're okay to take some questions when you go back down. Fantastic. Great stuff.